Good evening, everybody. Thank you for braving the cold and the snow to join us. I'm Professor Ara Mergen, and on behalf of the chair of the Italian Studies Department, Eugenio Refini, who's also here, along with the director of the Casa Italiana, Stefano Albertini, I welcome you all. In addition to our esteemed guest, Professor Carolina Mangone, who is associate professor in Princeton's Department of Art and Archaeology. Prior to joining Princeton's department, she was a Mellon postdoctoral fellow and lecturer in the Department of Art and Archaeology at Columbia, and her research has been supported by, among many different entities, the Shirk Council of Canada, the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal, the Center for for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts of the National Gallery, and ITATI at Florence. She's also currently director of Princeton's program in Italian Studies, which is really terrific. As a historian of early modern art and architecture, Carolina is particularly interested, as we will see, in concepts and practices of imitating, copying, simulating, and faking the materials and techniques of art and their movement across media and professional boundaries, and the afterlives of early modern artists and architects in text and image. Her first terrific, amazing book, Bernini's Michelangelo, which came out with Yale in 2020, examines the contested ways in which Gian Lorenzo Bernini constructed an artistic theory by imitating the art and architecture of Michelangelo. She's also the co-editor with Yvonne Levy of Material Bernini, the essays of which, for the first time, studied his sculptural production specifically through different material and intermedial perspectives. Carolina is currently working on a book on Michelangelo's lifelong penchant for leaving his sculpture rough and unfinished, a project from which tonight's talk is plainly drawn, challenging the notion that these are unintentionally incomplete works that lie beyond historical contextualization. Her project situates the production and reception of Michelangelo's Non-Finito within an expanded period view that considers unfinishedness as both purposeful and disruptive. I know we're all excited to hear more about this, so please join me in welcoming Carolina Mangone.
Thank you, Ara, for the introduction and especially for the invitation. I am delighted to be at the Casa Italiana, and I'm grateful for the fact that they are hosting me, as well as NYU's Department of Italian. Ara said that there were going to be a lot of people, and in my world, that means like 15 or 20, so thank you. What it means is, though, that I gave this paper for the first time a while ago in a much shorter form, and I was testing it out, and it has since developed. And I said this the first time I gave it, and I think it's even more important to state it now, is what I'm about to present is very narrowly focused. It is highly speculative, and hopefully it's plausible. A few years prior to his death in 1564, Michelangelo stood before his statue of a standing mourner holding up the dead Christ, a statue which he had brought to a fairly advanced state of progress, and began to mutilate it. Carving gradually and deeply into the original composition, he extracted a perplexing new figural pair, now merged into one out of material necessity, their thinned bodies corrugated by marks of the chisel. Any further attempt to finish or polish these figures would have resulted in their obliteration. Roughly hewn and physically slight, their forms contrast the refinement and muscularity of the fragmented arm that belonged to the original version of the Christ, a vestige that Michelangelo conspicuously preserved. This remnant limb testifies not only to the loss of the statue that was, but also to the status of the figures that supplanted it as born of a ruin. Although the condition of this statue, the Rondanini Pietà, is unique in Michelangelo's oeuvre, even unique among his most unfinished works, it was not his first attempt at radically revising his own sculpture. Around 1555, he took a hammer to his four-figure Florence Pietà, on which he had been working for about 7 years, and broke nearly all the limbs, save for Christ's left leg and Nicodemus's arms. Since the biographer Giorgio Vasari first wrote about it, this dismemberment has been widely understood as a destructive act motivated by one or more aggravations: the poor quality of the stone, the incessant prodding of a servant, the potentially undignified position of a leg, the technical difficulty of carving many figures from one block, or even the conflict between his aesthetic ambition and his Christian purpose. Whatever drove Michelangelo to break the Florentine Pietà, it is likely that his blows were not a haphazard maiming of the statue, so much as a selective amputation undertaken with the goal of remaking it using the remaining material. This was Jack Wasserman's compelling argument over 20 years ago, and I think it's too often ignored. Wasserman proposed that Michelangelo calculatedly dismembered the limbs while preserving enough marble at the core to reduce the group to three, or more likely to two figures, that is, to Christ and Nicodemus alone. If undertaken, it probably would have resembled a freestanding version of Stefano Maderno's relief of Nicodemus holding the dead Christ. But the intended carving was ultimately abandoned in favor of the sculpture's restoration by one of Michelangelo's trusted associates. Nonetheless, Wasserman's framing of the Florence Pietà's disfigurement as a new beginning rather than a violent end invites us to explore the possibility of a similar dialogue between destruction and creation relative to the Rondanini Pietà. That some early modern viewers associated Michelangelo's artistic creativity with acts of destruction is suggested by an anecdote told in Filippo Baldinucci's Notizia of 1681 about a wax or clay model that a young Giambologna proudly showed to the mature Michelangelo. Baldinucci wrote, "Giambologna used to recount to his friends how, having one day made a model of his own invention, which he had finished, as we commonly say, with his breath, he went to show it to the great Michelangelo. Michelangelo took it in hand and immediately ruined it, but as seemed best to him, giving it a new attitude and resolving it with marvelous bravura into the total opposite of what the young man had made, saying, 'Now, first go learn how to sketch, and then how to finish.'" The brutality with which Michelangelo treated Giambologna's model is twofold. First, he crushes the finished figure, and then he remakes it afresh with bravura, that is, with the violence of virtuoso execution. Where Giambologna had created a painstakingly refined model, indicated by the description, "finished with his breath," Michelangelo, it is implied, produced a roughly worked model that was neither polished nor brought to perfection. It was the opposite of Giambologna's finish. Now, what's important for the present context is not how Michelangelo's lesson pertains specifically to sketchy modeling in soft preparatory materials. Rather, more broadly, how it underscored the productive intertwining of making and unmaking in Michelangelo's practice. Unlike modeling in malleable materials, carving in hard marble is a necessarily violent process that entails ruining some of the material in order to shape it. The forcefulness associated with working this medium is especially perceptible in unfinished statues, their surfaces rutted with chisel marks that call to mind the blows of the hammer that produced them. Sigismondo Fanti's fictional representation of Michelangelo in the act of carving a statue makes, I think, the point even more vividly. Straddling over the statue of a female figure in progress, the sculptor is shown bringing forth life from the stone through the fall of seemingly deadly strikes. Fanti's printed image of a statue in the making tellingly inverted a recent fresco showing a statue being unmade. In the painting by Giulio Romano, an iconoclast is shown in the same pose that Fanti gave to Michelangelo, only this figure's hammer is poised to devitalize sculpture by demolishing it. The ambiguity of this motif, representing facture in one image and fracture in another, has implications for how we might read the damage Michelangelo wrought on the Rondanini Pietà. Michelangelo was not an iconoclast, yet his mutilation of the statue has been evocatively described as a soft iconoclasm, driven by a deeply personal and reform-minded rejection of the aesthetic ambitions that he had long infused into religious sculpture. Indeed, there's no denying the gulf between the heroically twisting bodies that he typically carved and those of this last Pietà. But insomuch as Michelangelo's mutilation of the statue might be likened to iconoclasm, I propose that the goal was not to strip his artistry of religious error, but rather to purge his material of its imperfection, and thus through destruction to restore integrity, that of his marble and the integrity of his subject. So let me clarify in part what I mean. And to do so, it's useful to underscore that Michelangelo's approach to making his two late Pietàs diverged significantly. While the Florence Pietà was tactically pruned to accommodate a simplified new composition, the Rondanini Pietà was steadily stripped, such that Michelangelo chiseled himself into an impasse. The difference is telling, I think. Strategic fragmentation implies that the artist had some idea of the direction he wanted to go with the material that had remained. Excessive subtraction, by contrast, suggests that his toolwork was more probing than planned. Remaking the figures afresh was thus not likely the primary motivation for destroying the first version of the Rondanini Pietà, as it had been for the Florence Pietà. The impetus for remaking the former is instead to be found elsewhere, I think, as I will argue, in the marble itself. Specifically in a material defect, the traces of which have gone largely unobserved, except for some musings by the late Peter Rockwell, renowned expert in stone carving, and an insightful dissertation chapter by James Anno, now curator at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. To contend with the flaw in the stone, as what I hope to show, Michelangelo adopted a different form of ruination than that applied to the Florence Pietà. There, destruction opened a fresh opportunity for creation. In the Rondanini Pietà, Michelangelo created as he destroyed, folding one act into the other. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's start at the beginning. There are no certain dates for the Rondanini Pietà's production, nor is it even mentioned directly by Michelangelo's biographers Giorgio Vasari and Ascanio Condivi. In Vasari's 1568 Vita, we read that after the sculptor disfigured the Florence Pietà, quote, it became necessary to find some marble on which Michelangelo could daily pass time with the chisel, and another piece of marble was put before him from which another Pietà had already been blocked out. Now, scholars generally agree that the already blocked sculpture refers to the original version of the Rondanini Pietà, which would situate its inception sometime between Vasari's first biography in 1550, where the statue is not mentioned at all, and then the destruction of the Florence Pietà in 1555. But to follow this logic, I think, is to embrace the improbable, even for Michelangelo, that not only was he carving two monumental Pietàs concurrently, but also that he was making both for himself at the same time. Instead of overlapping execution, I favor their close succession, with the inception of the Rondanini Pietà, a direct extension of the creative possibilities that were opened, though not realized, by the Florence Pietà's calculated ruination. In its first version, the Rondanini Pietà likely resembled the duo seen across 3 sketches here, 1, 2, 3, which explore how Christ's limp body could be held up by a mourner whose own body arced forward from the burden. Although the sketched figures lack a clear ground plane, the sculpted mourner stands on a rock while the Christ's legs sweep the earth below. These contextual cues indicate that the initial statue likely represented Christ being lowered either from the cross, as in a deposition, or into the ground, as in an entombment. Both possibilities are reinforced by the ambiguous gender of the supporting figure in the first iteration. Note that in contrast to the Virgin's delicate visage in the final version, the traces of an upturned face that are visible in her headcloth indicate an earlier head that was not definitively female. What's more, the headcloth on this earlier head could also either be the Virgin's veil or a hood, like that of Nicodemus in the Florence Pietà, which also happened to be an allegorical self-portrait. Supporting the identification here, too, as Nicodemus, is the mourning figure's exposed left leg, which John T. Paoletti dated to the first carving campaign and argued should be understood as masculine, since decorum would have prohibited representing the Virgin with her flesh thus uncovered. If we understand the original mourner as male, then the group's iconography more vividly resonated with the Florentine Pietà's plausible recarving into a Christ and Nicodemus alone, and then it's taken up in this statue. Having brought the initial version of the Rondanini Pietà to an advanced state, Michelangelo radically changed course. He chiseled into Christ's body, moving ever inward, such that he excised nearly everything of the original figure from the mid-chest upward. This is a perplexing method, since it left him too little stone to recarve even one fully corporeal figure, let alone 2. Michelangelo's approach is best explained if we consider a material catalyst for his recarving. Scrutiny of the existing marble reveals a vein on Christ's upper right thigh where the stone is highly polished. Given that Christ's legs were likely a part of the original carving campaign, we can deduce that the vein appeared while carving the initial statue. Now, this flaw would hardly be consequential if not for additional veining in the upper right shoulder of the roughly carved portion of Christ's body. These 2 separate marks are diagonally aligned, and when viewed together, they can be understood as the traces of a once deep and continuous streak that ran upward and inward from the thigh, through the chest, right shoulder, and upper arm, and probably across Christ's face, which initially leaned on his own shoulder. In other words, the vein marred those parts of the original Christ that Michelangelo chiseled away. All the other alterations responded to this change. The vein's removal was necessarily exploratory, since when the sculptor began excising the blemish, he could not have known or predicted its full extent. As he dug ever deeper to remove the vein, he amputated the original right forearm and shaved off so much of Christ's original upper body that he approached the inner core of the block. But Michelangelo stopped short of eliminating the offending mark entirely. To do so would have made it impossible to realize even the strangely withered pair that he ultimately managed. Michelangelo's acceptance of the stone's radically hampered condition should not be understood as passive resignation, so much as proactive persistence, perhaps even a collaboration with a flawed material. His resolve to work with the vein notably contrasts his decision decades earlier to start over with a new block of marble when, very late in the carving process, a black mark emerged as he began shaping the face of his first version of the risen Christ. The abandoned statue was completed by another sculptor in the 17th century and is now identified as the Christ in Bassano Romano, the one that you see there, the telltale vein marring its visage. Starting a statue of the risen Christ afresh with new material, once he abandoned that one, was an extreme response to his exacting standards for marble, which he preferred to be, quote, white, without any veins, stains, or hairline cracks, end quote. Yet he was often constrained to carve statues from imperfect materials. The Bacchus has veins on its cheeks and a dark mark running down its back and along the faun's shoulder. The rebellious slave has a crack running across its face and down the right shoulder as well. And the knight was formed from a flawed block that made it impossible to fully realize the left arm. In these examples, Michelangelo did not accommodate his carving to the blemishes in the stone, but instead continued with his idea for the figure despite them. By contrast, in the Rondanini Pietà, he worked with the imperfection in the marble, using it as a cue for how to move forward compositionally and iconographically, and leading him to incorporate the flaw into the statue's meaning. To the extent that we're accustomed to thinking about Michelangelo as collaborating with his material, it is typically regarding his self-imposed commitment to carving sculpture from the confines of a single block of marble, whether he was fashioning one figure from it or four. Less familiar is the notion of Michelangelo allowing a flaw in the stone to shape the formal qualities of his work as he carved, at least not so dramatically as he does here, even as he still determined the subject. In this last statue, he cooperated with the marble defect, allowing the stone's particular material affordances to drive his idea, transforming the blemish, if not exactly into an aesthetic virtue, then at least into an integral and worthy part of his sacred subject. Michelangelo's campaign of recarving, probably ongoing from about 1560 until days before his death 4 years later, transformed the statue from a figure struggling to support another to that of two figures integrated into a single and self-sustaining body. Although Christ's original legs were left largely untouched, his upper form shifted toward the right as Michelangelo extracted a new torso, arms, and head from his supporter's body. The formerly load-bearing function of the mourner now ceded to an embrace that incorporates Christ's form into its own. This fusion inspired adjustments to the positioning of the two heads. Christ's now was transformed from slumping to upright, and that of his supporter, now definitively the Virgin, was oriented downward. If Michelangelo had in fact originally intended the supporting figure to be Nicodemus, the late switch to the Virgin was probably a response to the newly intimate condition between Christ and his supporter that resulted from excising the vein. As the figures increasingly merged, such that the Son's flesh was literally fashioned from the material of his mother's body, the iconography of the Passion coalesced with that of the Incarnation. In this new image of the Virgin holding Christ after his crucifixion, the absorbing arc of her body is backward-looking or analeptic, recalling the Son's birth even as she embraces his adult form. The blending and dissolution of the physical boundaries between them also poignantly conveys the mystical union of Christ's two natures, human and divine. Michelangelo evidently appreciated this bodily fusion as a generative and theologically sound consequence of contending with the limitations imposed by accommodating the marble's flaws. Christ's strange corporeality emerges directly from the intersection of purgation and facture. Although Michelangelo's extensive removal of the vein creates the effect of a body stripped of its material trappings, leading scholars to interpret the slight form as insubstantial and spiritually transcendent, the chisel marks over Christ's torso nonetheless also accentuate the physical, material reality of his mortal flesh. Michelangelo produced this raw and irregular surface mostly with a gradina, or a toothed chisel, his preferred tool, and the instrument he typically wielded in meticulously hatched and cross-hatched motions to model the contours of a figure's penultimate skin. One need only compare the characteristic toothing of flesh on the early St. Matthew to that of Christ's torso in the Rondanini Pietà to appreciate the difference. In the latter, Michelangelo manipulated the gradina to brutal effect, shifting its purpose from the enlivening rendering of skin to its crude mortification. The deliberate rawness and force with which he plied his tool over Christ's flesh is underscored by comparison to the more delicate and rhythmical application to shape Mary's new forearm. And I'm sorry, it's hard to see here. Christ's abraded skin conjures the flagellation and bodily suffering he endured throughout the Passion so as to cleanse not himself, but humanity of its sin. The insistent chiseling corresponds to the areas where Michelangelo excised the marble's impurities, thus vividly conflating the representation of mortified flesh with the reality of purged matter. In the Christ's raw flesh, scholars have recognized parallels to Michelangelo's poetic conflation of the sculptural process with spiritual redemption. This is especially vivid in a poem in which he expresses longing for the release of his own soul from its haggard mortal coil. He writes, "From what sharp biting file does your tired skin keep growing thin and failing, O ailing soul? When will time release you from it, so you'll return to heaven where you were pure and joyful before, your dangerous and mortal veil cast off? For even if I change my hide in my final brief years, I cannot change my old established habits, which, as more as days pass, weigh down and compel me more." And it continues. In the opening line, Michelangelo equates skin with stone by attributing the feebleness of aging flesh to the work of the file or the rasp, the lima, the tool that sculptors usually employed for smoothing and refining a marble surface, though which here is indicating its depletion and its abrasion. This poetic reversal of the tool's function echoes how Michelangelo's actual gradina performed the opposite of its usual purpose in the Rondanini Pietà. And like the so-called skin or scorza of a marble mass, the flesh that envelops the poet-sculptor's body is a physical barrier to spiritual transcendence. Yet Michelangelo despairs that no degree of stripping the exterior or changing his hide is sufficient to atone for the sins that burden his inner being. The final lines thus acknowledge the necessity of divine intervention. The poem's self-referential correlation of skin to stone, sculpting to salvation, makes it possible to read the deep grooves over Christ's torso as an expression of Michelangelo's personal devotion, particularly his yearning for redemption through direct interaction with the Savior's flesh. Although he did not portray himself in this sculpture, as he had through the allegorical self-portrait as Nicodemus in the previous Pietà, Michelangelo's physical presence is nonetheless conspicuous in the tactile traces of his chisel working the marble surface. As Michelangelo carved, he had ample time to reflect on the suffering of Christ and his ultimate transcendence. Whether or not we believe the report that Michelangelo worked on the statue until 6 days before his death, chiseling while, quote, suffering over Christ's body, end quote, we can deduce that the aged sculptor's final touches were those of the gradina on the ever-dwindling torso. Michelangelo would have long recognized that the goal of his labor could not be completion. The more material he removed, the more unfinishable the sculpture became. Absent a conventional end, Michelangelo's protracted carving allowed him to maintain physical contact with Christ's body as he contemplated the Passion and, in turn, suffered over Christ. Such sustained chiseling, a form of perseverance in the face of physical, spiritual, and artistic adversity, here became both the representation of Christ's agony and Michelangelo's self-reflexive imitation of it. He wasn't just making an image anymore. Rather, by actively toiling over marble flesh, Michelangelo also situated himself in the image of Christ's suffering. Yet the abject body that results from Michelangelo's purgative facture sits uneasily within an established Christian tradition that likened the perfecting of the soul to the formation of a beautiful sculpture. The idea originated in the writing of the 3rd century philosopher Plotinus, who advised the following: If you do not see yourself as beautiful, then just as someone making a statue, which has to be beautiful, cuts away here and polishes there and makes one part smooth and clears another till he has given his statue a beautiful face, so too you must cut away the excess and straighten the crooked and clear the dark." End quote. Christian theologians and mystics adapted the analogy to suggest that one's original unstained likeness to Christ could be achieved by carving away the sinful and superfluous matter that obstructed the pure beauty of the soul latent within. The physical reality of Michelangelo's sculpture, however, resonates far more closely with a negative variation on this analogy that was introduced by the French Jesuit Nicolas Caussin in 1642, much after Michelangelo. Caussin employed it to admonish priests whose good intentions for their subjects went too far, leading them to operate, quote, "like bad sculptors who strike so many blows of the hammer and chisel on the stone they have undertaken to polish, that in trying to shape it, they break it, and instead of a figure, create nothingness." Caussin's characterization of excess purging is useful, though not to impugn Michelangelo as a bad sculptor. Rather, it helps us to see that whereas Caussin put shaping in opposition to breaking, Michelangelo conflated them as he shaped a broken body. Michelangelo's Christ is not just broken, it's also bloody, at least in a metaphorical sense. The dark streak that still mars the monochrome material also reads as blood that enlivens it and the figure from within. The double meaning of vein, or vena in Italian, that is both as an imperfection in the marble and as a blood vessel in the living body, cannot have gone unnoticed by Michelangelo. The lexical correlation between marble veins and bodily ones was made explicit in Ovid's well-known and much illustrated story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who, following a deadly deluge, recreated humanity by throwing stones behind them that turned into beings as they hit the ground. The key line is Ovid's claim that as the figures came to life, quote, "that which had been veins in the stone survived under the same name in the incarnate beings," end quote. The path of the marble vein in Michelangelo's statue runs the length of Christ's side, not just as if blood channeled through a vessel in the body, but conceivably also as blood issuing from the very chest wound that he received from the soldier's lance while on the cross. Although Michelangelo had not incorporated a vein into the narrative of a statue or its process before, the generation of sculptors before him regularly found savvy means of incorporating the unexpected appearance of material impurities into the fiction of their finished works. A dark diagonal vein in the marble slab used by Luca della Robbia, for example, appears to have shaped the sweep of drapery that the sculptor chiseled to preserve the modesty of a tambourine-playing puto. And closer to the narrative force of the vein in Michelangelo's statue, Matteo Civitali carved a bust of Christ with a flagellum in which material blemishes on the figure's head and left shoulder resembled bruised flesh. It is in this tradition that we can also situate Vasari's praise for Matteo del Nazzaro's lost deposition of Christ, which was a small image carved from green jasper that the biographer evocatively described as macchiato with red droplets. Vasari also wrote that Nazaro, quote, "worked with such diligence that he made wounds come to those very parts of the jasper that were spotted with the color of blood," end quote. All of these statues had an ancient precedent that was certainly known to Michelangelo in his early years training in the Medici garden, a torso fragment in porphyry representing the flayed Marsyas that looked something like this one. According to Vasari, it had been, quote, "wrought with such care and judgment that certain delicate white veins which were in the red stone were carved exactly in the right places to appear like little nerves, as seen in real bodies when they have been flayed, making the work appear to be most lifelike," end quote. Michelangelo, in turn, animated his figure by embracing the twofold nature of the vein as both a material impurity in living stone and as the purifying blood of the incarnate Christ. Passing over the blood-like vein with his chisels and hands would have brought Michelangelo into intimate meditation on the salvation offered by Christ's passion. In this sense, his carving process complements the spiritual poems Michelangelo was writing in the last decade of his life about the enormity of Christ's torment and the redemptive efficacy of being washed in the Savior's blood. In one sonnet, he wrote, "But yet it seems that in your blood we sense that as your torture for us had no match, so are your precious gifts without a limit." End quote. He also explored the theme with his spiritual friend, Vittoria Colonna, to whom he gave a drawing of the Pietà with a line from Dante's Paradiso along the cross, which in this context referred to Christ's bodily sacrifice. "They do not know how much blood it costs," reads the line along the cross there. It's a paradoxical quote to juxtapose with the pristine, bloodless Christ in the drawing. In this image, as in others like it by Michelangelo, he typically preferred a heroic, bloodless body that corresponded to a more intellectualized meditation on Christ's torment. Except in this last statue, where the raw flesh and blood of Christ's ordeal would have facilitated deeply affective and sensual meditation. As such, I think it was fundamentally closer to the emotional spirituality preferred by Vittoria Colonna, who wrote about her desire to meditate on the brutal physicality of Christ's suffering through a body that she described was, quote, "not in divine beauty, but ugly and livid, not shown in majesty, but abject. I do not ask for a Christ bathed with great joy by the waters of Jordan, with the glory of the heavens open, but rather all full of blood, with 1,000 wounds lacerated on the cross." The unique blend of meditative piety and sculptural process that defines the Rondanini Pietà also resembles Michelangelo's very novel use of the medium of drawing in his very last years. Across 8 crucifixions produced around 1560 are densely wrought compositions characterized by intense repetition, re-elaboration, and canceling of lines without resolution and often verging on illegibility. Michelangelo had reworked drawings before, but never utilizing such intense overlay nor such equivocal effect. Traces of the artist's searching hand are consistent throughout, as he rendered contours and poses in black chalk and then remade them over and again, sometimes reinforcing marks, other times smudging them. These heavily reworked figures are too indeterminate to serve as preparatory sketches for any work. They are instead autonomous images that satisfied Michelangelo's private devotional needs. They should thus be understood as complete, even in their unconventional states. So too, I would say, the Rondanini Pietà. Michelangelo's intensive acts of refiguration across paper and marble alike bring the late crucifixion drawings and the Rondanini Pietà into a meaningful dialogue, notwithstanding the fact that constant revisions to the marble thinned the figures almost to the marrow, whereas those of the sketches amplified the bodies into near plastic relief. Consider this rendering of Christ in the drawing, where the repetition of contour lines around the torso and the limbs is so dense, it's difficult to choose one line as any more definitive than another. The accumulated marks indicate a hand that is simultaneously making and exploring, touching and reflecting. This physical mode of pondering is especially apparent in the accumulation of thick hatching lines along Christ's right side, which cannot easily be identified as either cast shadow or clarifying contour. A correlation can be made to the sculpting of Christ's torso in the Rondanini Pietà, where the irregular jumble of chisel tracks, up, down, diagonal, sideways, divulge Michelangelo's prolonged and unresolved searching for definite contours. By way of tactile engagement of both his chisel and his chalk, Michelangelo produced overworked surfaces that engaged in a form of deeply sensual and material meditation on Christ's physical body. And yet, as intimated earlier, it's owing to the roughly chiseled surface that the figure of Christ embodies a paradox. His corporeal form is as materially present as it is dematerialized, its dissolution into spirit imminent. With lacerated raw flesh doubling as its opposite, that is, as matter that is almost totally lost all substance or weight, another iconographical layer of the remade statue emerges, the resurrection, that culminates the Passion narrative. What I'm suggesting is that the corrugated marble articulates the contradiction of Christ's physical suffering and spiritual transcendence all in one. This conflation is also present, if in a much more refined artistic treatment, in Michelangelo's numerous drawings of the risen Christ, especially this one, in which the Savior embodies an indeterminate state, his unusually passive and elongated form drifting weightlessly upward from the tomb as his mortal flesh transforms into something divine and eternal. In the drawing, the materiality of Christ's body is transcended by the luminescence of his polished contours. In the statue, by contrast, it is the extreme absence of polish in emaciated and living matter that gestures to the otherworldly. The subject of the resurrection is further underscored, I think, by the act of recarving itself. It bears recalling that a young Michelangelo carved his David from the material remains of a botched attempt at the same subject undertaken by an artist decades prior. After 70 years, Michelangelo took the long-abandoned marble block, which had already been partially carved, and he extracted an entirely new figure from it, though he purposefully left some of the previous sculptor's chisel work visible on the head. Vasari thought these traces testified to a miracle, one defined by the sculptor's technical feat of, quote, resuscitating one who was dead. That is, of giving new life to a piece of stone that most had deemed incapable of being salvaged. While the triumphantly recarved David contrasts the humbly remade Pietà, the notion of resurrection nonetheless resonates in the latter, not just technically, but also thematically. Indeed, the co-presence of vestigial arm and final form, essentially of Christ before and after, evokes his triumph over death. Michelangelo did not set out to carve a statue in a crude state that laid bare the traces of a purgative sculptural process. But as the flaw in the marble became insurmountable, his purpose shifted from a devotional sculpture that merely represented intimate contact between Christ and a mourner, to one that materialized it, both in the corporeal fusion of mother and son and in the processual touch of the artist himself. The unfamiliar result was not quite an ideological rejection of his previous artistic tenets, so much as a circumstantial exploration of a meaningful alternative to which, at the end of his life, he was newly open. When Michelangelo committed to working with and through the vein, and thus to remaking Christ's form, simultaneously purging and producing, he embraced the risk that eliminating the material imperfection would, in turn, generate imperfect figuration. By taking this artistic leap of faith, Michelangelo put into sculptural practice his love of God above his passion for perfect artifice. Michelangelo's unfinishable last statue culminates his lifelong experimentation with imperfect statuary by pursuing a new role for the Non-Finito, that is for unfinished works, in the economy of devotion. He had left sacred sculptures unfinished before, lots of them, but they were all figures left in the making. Not until the Rondanini Pietà did he instrumentalize the tension between making and unmaking to spiritual ends. In doing so, he revealed a deeper relationship to his material than that which is suggested in his most famous poem, the first lines of which commentators frequently characterize as Michelangelo's theory of carving. They read thus: "The greatest artist does not have any concept that a single piece of marble does not circumscribe within its excess, and that is only attained by the hand that obeys the intellect." Scholars have concentrated on the term concept, concetto, and on the difficult relationship between the idea or concept in the artist's mind and the hand that works to extract it from a single block. Equally as important is the word circumscribe, circumscriva, which refers to both the form within the interior of the block and then ultimately to the finished figure that will be defined and bound by polished contours. Seen from the vantage of circumscription, the Rondanini Pietà proved decidedly intractable in both iterations of its form. The accidental appearance of the vein in the marble led Michelangelo to see his first idea as it was nearing completion, as it was nearing circumscription, suddenly encumbered by so much excess, so much superchia, another key word in the poem, that now called for removal. As he worked with the affordances of the deeply entrenched vein, excess and circumscription remained in constant tension. In their constant negotiation, Michelangelo discovered a deeper truth about his idea, one which was facilitated by the blemish hidden under the marble, and that is the belief that God's divinity cannot be circumscribed. By carving Christ as both a suffering mortal and a transcendent God, as material and dematerialized, as finite and infinite, Michelangelo expressed Christ's mystical nature. It is ultimately then not despite its destruction, but rather because of it, that the Rondanini Pietà declared itself as the sculptor's creative affirmation of artistic and personal imperfection combined. Thank you.
There's a microphone going around for questions.
I have a microphone here.
In light of the recent sale of the sketch of the foot of the Sibyl, Michelangelo did do some very finished, but that's a particularly finished sketch, and it's not overworked or whatever. But the commission for the Sistine Chapel was Pope Julius, so he had somebody on his back to push him to finish. Now these two pieces, the Pietà, later Pietàs, were of his own doing. So do you find any information about an artist being driven by someone outside himself and one who can just, with his own conscious development, can go on and on forever, not having this finite design?
Yeah, that's a question that I think is essential when thinking about artists with long lives who are producing works for their tombs, or at least for themselves at the end of their lives. I think, like the vein, the end is uncertain. And so you are potentially working towards that end without knowing when it's going to come. So the impetus to finish is fueled, I think, by an unknown, right? But also the desire to hold back, to not finish. Finishing the statue would mean, I think, for Michelangelo to pick up something else and to start again, to move his hands again around a work of art. So I suspect had he finished the Rondanini Pietà, we would have had something else that he worked on. And there are a few smaller things that might have occupied his hands if, it's not true that he was working on this till 4 or 5 days before his death. It's a hard question to answer. I know if I don't have someone on my back, I'm not finishing anything. I think some people are just more driven than others.
So I can talk real loud, okay? I just would love to know what drew you to this initially to engage in. Obviously, you must be profoundly involved with writing about this and thinking about it. So if you could, I just love the personal connection to our work.
Sure,
If you
sure.
could talk about that.
Yeah, I'm happier to talk about that. My first book focused on a sculptor, architect of the later century of the Baroque, Gian Lorenzo Bernini. And there's a document by one of his patrons. And the document, it's a letter to a dealer. And it asks the dealer if they still have an unfinished work by Michelangelo for sale. Because if they could buy it for cheap, they'd have Bernini finish it. Reading that document eons ago when I was working on my dissertation, I'm like, what? How is that? Number one, Non-Finito is cheap. It's 1620, now a Non-Finito is cheap. And how can you finish a Non-Finito? And so that led me to a tiny little paper that I've never finished on instances of people finishing Michelangelo's sculpture. And in looking at that, I realized that I was unsatisfied with the literature on the Non-Finito, and that unsatisfied in the sense that it seemed to resist a monographic treatment. And it resists a monographic treatment because the Non-Finito is so heterogeneous in Michelangelo's career. From the first statue to his last, not one of them is the same. And so, everybody who's talked about Michelangelo has put out a theory of the Non-Finito. I'm trying to allow each group of sculptors to speak to what his interests are in any given moment. And that means that over the course of his lifetime, I have very different approaches to what I think is happening and what is meaningful for Michelangelo in any given moment. But I came to it from a shock revelation that you could finish a Michelangelo. This was news to me. And it was cheap. I was also like, okay.
I am wondering how, thank you. Non-Finito being non-finished, or not finished, rather, and the Rondanini Pietà being worked past, after it was finished, he lacerated it, he kept working on it, he kept transforming it. So yes, it, gives an impression of a non-finito, but it is the exact opposite of that. So how philologically, I guess, and logically, how does that work?
That's a great question. Let me be transparent. I don't like the term non-finito because it is too narrow. It introduces the opposition, which is finish, and it creates this dyad that I don't like. I tend to only use the word when it comes up in texts of the period that I'm referring to, in part because there are lots of words that are used for non-finito, bozza, imperfecta. So in fact, my framework is a framework of imperfection, not of finish or not finish, which probably, makes evident that I actually think that most of Michelangelo's sculptures that don't have conventional finish are finished. I would say that he never set out to create an unfinished statue, But once he left them in the state that he left them in, they were as finished as they needed to be. And I think this is especially evident when you see him giving them away. He would not have given them away if he didn't think that they were okay for someone to look at and contemplate. This isn't always the case, but I would say it's mostly the case. So that they are purposeful to the extent that once he leaves them in that state, they are as complete as they need to be. But I dislike the word finished because I don't think it, or non-finito, because I don't think it captures the fullness of what's going on. So I would use imperfection, which is a kind of formal and aesthetic aspect, formal and aesthetic term, but also in the context of my book, works like the imperfect tense. So I think about Michelangelo as someone who was working on something that then is picked up by viewers who engage in it. My book is twofold: Michelangelo in the first part and reception in the second part. And so the imperfect tense works nicely in that way.
Thank you, Carolina. It was a beautiful talk. I have a question, perhaps more on the sort of side of reception in a way, in the sense that looking at your slides where you were talking, I mean, you showed us the Pietà Rondanini from these different angles, and I couldn't sort of, avoid thinking about what has changed in the exhibit of the Pietà since the, relocation to the new site, right? Like 10 years ago or so, the Pietà was brought from the traditional hall into this new space where now you can walk around it, whereas before it was impossible really to do a full appreciation. It was very beautiful in the previous exhibit, but of course things have changed. And I'm wondering whether, the way in which we can look at the Pietà now, is partly also part of this possibility of thinking about it in different ways, or, more simply, have you given any thought, I'm sure you have, to this different location? And really, this is about the people who go now and appreciate the sculpture.
I haven't put a lot of thought into the different installations, and I saw it in its earlier installation when I was very young. And then went back after it had been reinstalled. But I have to say the reinstallation for me was particularly transformative because it's in the center of a fabulous room that allows you to just sit in front of it for a long time, stand really close. And it was the kind of experience that I became totally absorbed in figuring out what his chisel was doing. And so for me, the current display is really kind of wonderful. Is it what has made this possible? In part, I mean, it's probably not a surprise that the turn to, discussions and studies of materials and materiality is really what has made this possible. It's what has made sculpture interesting to everybody who doesn't work on sculpture. And so I think it took that in part, but I think the display is also about a kind of awareness of a public that is fascinated by technique and by an object that is so remote historically, but appears because of, discourses about Rodin and otherwise, appears very close to our own moment in terms of, how we think about art and what its stakes are. So that's part of it too. But the display is super successful in that way.
Yeah, I just had a question. First of all, I can talk about it too, but
The mic is for the recording, so please speak into the mic.
okay. I just wanted to thank you. First of all, I worked with Peter Walkerell for many years. He was a dear friend of mine.
Extraordinary.
I studied with him as a sculptor, and I liked the use of the tool marks. He was obsessive about the tooth chisel and all of that, and Michelangelo's whole
I wish I would have met him.
Oh, you never met him?
No, that's extraordinary.
But he did talk about the tooth chisel and all of that, and how his unique use of tool marks and the Non-Finito a lot. My question is, and I love your discourse of the resurrection and the deposition at the same time, sort of entombment, the dead and the rising in the body and the vein. The only thing that confuses me, and I wish you would maybe address a bit, is the finished arm that sort of hangs on the side. That's sort of a very Greek, it's almost an antithesis to the other side. And there's that pattern, that sort of supportive link that you find in Greek statues. And was it there because it needed to support still the sculpture, so it would fall down without it? Or was it some dialogue between this sort of Greek and something and, idea of a new, era of his personal mark on the stone with his hand that you usually associate with painting as well. But if you could talk a little bit about that sort of dichotomy there, which can't sort of, figure out the relationship with the rest.
Yeah, I think that there are two ways of responding to this that I don't think are contradictory. The one is he left the hand on the arm on purpose. It's conspicuously present. He wants you to see a before and after. He wants you to understand. He wants you to understand that there's been a change. To my mind, he wants you to be able to discern the change that I think I've narrated, so that it's there to make clear, abundantly clear, that something has happened to the statue. To say, I didn't just do this. There is something that has happened between one and the other. It is also true that recent conservation, and I think it went hand in hand with the new display, has suggested that in terms of stability, that the arm needs to be there. That he could have removed the strut that's holding it and shaved it down maybe to here, because it's actually, if you cut it to below the elbow, it would still be standing and still support the statue. But it seems as though he understood that the forward weight of the statue and that arc required the counterweight of the arm and what it's connected to. So how high up? I think he could have lost a little bit. But I don't think the fact that it needed the arm for support in any way undermines the notion that he also was happy to have it there. He could have done something to it to make it look, he could have shaved it down to a stump or to something non-representational, just raw stone if he wanted to.
I would like to ask you if you agree about the idea that the Christ figure is coming directly from the painting that by Michelangelo of the Deposition that is in the National Gallery in London, because it's the same shape but mirrored.
Yeah, they're very, very close. It's not just that they're very close. I agree. There's a kind of deep formal connection. They're very close, and that closeness, I think, would reinforce the way in which he arrives at a very frontal Christ in this second reiteration or second carving. And in fact, I think it resonates with the twofold way that I'm reading it. So yes, they are fundamentally close, and you might think about it as either a conscious or unconscious return, because that painting was very early, to a kind of motif, thinking through a motif that he had already worked on years before in painting. I mean, the nice thing also is it's an unfinished painting too. So it affords him an opportunity to think about what he was doing earlier and what he ends up doing later. But yes, thank you.
If I may dare, this question is about his spiritual relationship with Christianity, lacerating Bacco or Davide, being an artist searching for new ways of portraying, of sort of making his work evolve, yes, cutting up Bacco is a very different act from cutting up Christ. What was his, what do you know about his journey, did he lacerate any other Christ figures till, this is his last work, which supposedly he finished, 5 days before he died. Earlier on, do we have examples of laceration, be it of religious, pagan or Christian figures?
We don't in his work. The closest I would say are those drawings, which are not lacerated, but worked thoroughly over and again. Depending on your views of attribution, there is a wooden small-scale Christ Christ on a crucifix in Casa Buonarroti that is carved in a very rough manner. But it is not something that we would see. It would have been a kind of shock to see a figure like this, such that one might mistake it for iconoclasm. When you see a ruinous statue, it's either an antiquity coming out of the ground, or it's a statue that has been defaced because it's thought to be, misdirecting the spirit. So no.
We have time for one or two more.
Thank you, Carolina. I really admired your sort of relentless effort to make every level, artistic, material, theological, your sort of relentless effort to make it all meaningful on behalf of Michelangelo and on behalf of this late work. And so, and part of me said, well, of course, because it's Michelangelo and it's the big M. And so so I think the sort of methodologically this effort is really admirable in the total rigor with which you are pushing and pushing to make it meaningful. On the other hand, there's also this sort of massive reinvestment in Michelangelo's canonicity that because it ends up being one more example of the great Michelangelo making everything meaningful to the very end. And I think it's interesting that you've also worked on Bernini and Michelangelo, so two very major figures. So I just ask you if you reflect a little on what it's like to work on a sort of major figure, and in particular to make the case for the continuing meaningfulness, almost sort of deep intentionality of it all, which was sort of the unwritten drive of your argument to me.
Yeah, it's weirdly crowded and lonely at the same time. So I will say this: what I don't want is to make all of Michelangelo's unfinished works triumphant, and which is why I was trying to juxtapose the David and the Rondanini Pietà. No one would have seen these two statues on the same level. The response to them would not have been equal. It would have been puzzling and shocking and confusing. So I don't want to lose that in the overall Why am I constantly recanonizing these artists? I would say this, that in one of the challenges in tackling, I have found, tackling major sculptors, is that it's a field that is, especially the field of Bernini, populated by men. And to write on sculpture as a woman is to do, as a female scholar, even if one doesn't do feminist scholarship, which I don't, is to do something different. One of the things I heard constantly when I worked on Bernini, which is a book on Bernini's lifelong imitation of Michelangelo, was, well, who wants to hear that he imitated Michelangelo? And I have a response for that. Male scholars who want him to be revolutionary and awesome. So that's, which is not to say that that's the excuse to return to them. What it is to say is that I think there are ways of approaching these scholars and seeing them, or these artists and seeing them afresh, that have faced a lot of resistance for a long time, that have to do with lots of institutional reasons. Am I recanonizing Michelangelo? Yes. Is that something that troubles me? Not so long as it opens us up to thinking about him anew. Is it overdetermined? Possibly. Did you enjoy listening to it? Is that a good enough response? Okay.